Many people with metastatic disease say this is a disease no one wants, but you meet the best people.
It's all about us. It's all about us. There's a theme that they can't touch, 'cause you know it's all about us.
Could a cure for cancer be closer than you think? Welcome to Live from Stage 4, where MBC takes center stage as we talk to experts, share inspiring stories, break down science, and shine the spotlight on what matters most. Because when it comes down to it, this spot, for us and by us, is all about us.
It's all about us. You can try. It's all about us. It's all about us.
Welcome to another episode of Live from Stage 4. I'm Victoria Goldberg. 20 years ago, Living Beyond Breast Cancer held its very first conference for people living with metastatic breast cancer, a small gathering at a hotel outside Philadelphia. Today, it's a 3-day national event. And in this episode, you'll hear the story of those 20 years from the people who built it. I sat down with 3 longtime LBBC leaders, Jean Sachs, Elyse Spatz Caplan, and Catherine Ormerod, and in a separate conversation with Janine Guglielmino, LBBC's former Vice President of Mission Delivery, who was there for that very first conference in 2006. Let's start with Jean, Elyse, and Kathy. I'm so happy and honored to have you here with me. It was Jean's idea to talk about not just the 20th anniversary, but the 20 years of this conference. And of course, who would be better to talk about it than the 3 of you? But before we get into this, let's do some introductions. And why don't I go around and ask you to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your history with LBBC, when it started, what you're up to now, and maybe just as a fun fact, what are your fondest memories at LBBC? Kathy, why don't we start with you? Are you comfortable to go first?
Sure. I am Catherine Ormerod, and I was the Executive Vice President for Strategy and Mission at LBBC from 2013 to 2023. So it was a wonderful 10 years. I had been at LBBC in the late 90s, and my greatest achievement there was hiring a young woman who had had breast cancer, and her name is Elyse Caplan. She will talk about her experience, but that's a fun fact, and I'll leave it at that.
Good one, Kathy.
All right, Elyse, then that's probably a good segue to you.
Okay, thank you, Kathy and all. My name is Elyse Spatz Caplan, and my connection to LBBC goes back to the year 2000, the turn of the century, when I was looking to make a change and roll up my sleeves and get on the ground and work with patients and families impacted by breast cancer. And I was there just shy of 14 years, leaving at the end of 2013 to pass the baton back to Catherine Ormerod, so that she could lead the charge going forward in the role that I played as Director of Educational Programs and Partnerships.
Thanks, Elyse. And last but not least, Jean Sachs, the CEO of LBBC.
Thanks so much for having all of us. This is so fun. So yes, I am Jean Sachs. I'm the CEO of Living Beyond Breast Cancer. I actually started at LBBC in 1996 when my son was less than 1 year old. I can keep track of that because he's 30, so it's easy to track those dates. It was a really small organization then, and I've just had the honor of working with an amazing staff, but I will have to say that losing Kathy and Elyse and Janine, who I know isn't here with us right now, but it was a big adjustment. They were amazing, and I'm still here. So my fun fact, just to build on what Kathy said, Kathy actually gave me my first job out of college. So she hired me, and then I got to hire her. So all of us have a really long connection together.
I love your fun fact. I hired her. She hired me back. I hired her. Okay. Well, then let's get to the history of the conference and let's talk about how it came about. What was the impetus for actually creating the conference? Jean and I had talked about it years ago on a different podcast, but I haven't spoken to Elyse and Kathy about it. So it's nice to talk about it again.
Elyse, I think you should go.
So in terms of why did Living Beyond Breast Cancer create the annual conference for people with metastatic breast cancer, top of mind for me are memories that LBBC was known for many years ago, creating conferences several times a year to reach people of all ages and all stages of breast cancer for that face-to-face, in-person connection, not only to peers and other survivors, but also to prominent physicians and breast cancer specialists across the gamut, from psychosocial experts to medical oncologists to surgeons, and so on and so forth. And my recollection was that the fall conference had something for people at all stages and all ages. There were sessions tailored for each. And then the annual conference for young women that was happening in partnership with Young Survival Coalition also had something for the younger demographic, but in addition, had sessions for metastatic breast cancer. What we learned was people with metastatic breast cancer that were coming to the conferences wanted to be served more fully. And so that led to the development of a national survey fielded in the United States, for which we expected and we would have hoped for 200 responses. And we were delighted that nearly 700 people completed the survey. This was a survey with more than 60 questions that took about a half hour to complete, that attested to the fact that when you ask the metastatic breast cancer community, and this was back in 2005, what did they want? What did they need? What were the gaps in resources? They took the time to tell us very specifically. And it was the results of that survey that helped to validate that a face-to-face conference that was exclusively for people with stage 4 or metastatic breast cancer was highly desired.
I think I'd like to add that when I was back at LBBC in 2015 or so, when I was doing some research about why we were starting the Hear My Voice metastatic breast cancer advocacy program, I went back and looked at Elyse and Musa Mayer's research on that survey and discovered it was really the first one in the world to go to people living with metastatic disease and ask them, what is it you want and need? So it was really groundbreaking.
And I will just add that Musa Mayer was our partner on this, and she had written a book, I think it was in 1994, about the experience. And at that time, it was called Advanced Breast Cancer. And it was really that book that was part of what inspired us to reach out to Musa and say, will you do this project for us? Elyse made the connection. And she was such a critical part, bringing her expertise of interviewing so many women living with metastatic breast cancer, then bringing it to the survey. And another important thing is this was early days of the internet. So we did field this online, but we also went on to do a paper survey because it was a time when not everybody was online and we wanted to make sure there was representation. I think we got a couple hundred responses from the paper survey, but I just remember all the paper coming into the office and the work that had to be done to get that all tabulated was super important. So it was a very thoughtful process, and those results were absolutely the catalyst for the conference.
So to build on what Kathy and Jean added to my initial remarks, the other thing that I think was important to note is that Living Beyond Breast Cancer, as Kathy had said, it was the first patient survey fielded. So when the data was analyzed, we then shared it very broadly, nationally, Because what good would it be if one organization that fielded the survey held all the information when it takes a village to create the resources and support? So LBBC created a white paper that was entitled Silent Voices, which was a compilation of the data, the questions, the responses, and it really showed a roadmap. And that white paper was then the basis for creating abstracts and posters that were both accepted and presented at the first ABC1, or the Advanced Breast Cancer Consensus Conference that happens every other year in Lisbon. It was presented as a best abstract for an oral presentation, not even a poster, because it was groundbreaking. And it was also presented at SABCS. So again, just to acknowledge that LBBC did want to share this broadly, and it did lead to another organization that chose to take the learnings and create a global survey to survey people outside the US.
Can we talk about that organization?
Yeah, so it was Pfizer that really picked up the information. They took it internally, they discussed it, they decided to do their own survey. So they created their own questions, but it was building on some of the data and the learnings from the US. They called it the Bridge Survey. And they did invite LBBC to serve on their steering committee because we're the firsts to study this specific population in such depth. That's a little bit about the next step in trying to get more voices and more experiences outside the US.
To put this into perspective with my personal experience. So we're talking 20 years ago. I had been diagnosed with early stage cancer in 2004. And I remember so vividly how we did not talk about, as you said, silent voices. We were afraid of people with metastatic breast cancer. And even in 2014, when I was diagnosed metastatic, it was still a taboo. So it's pretty incredible that you guys took it upon yourself then and recognized the need at the time when the average survival was what, 3 years?
On that point, Victoria, if you're diagnosed with triple negative breast cancer, the life expectancy was even shorter than what you just said.
You just mentioned ABC1. I spent this weekend editing my interview with Dr. Fatima Cardozo, and she was telling me that the average 5-year survival for triple negative is still 14 months. And that's frightening and it's scary, but we have made some progress. I just wanted to point out that when you started this, now it seems obvious. Why not have an MBC conference? But 20 years ago, this was not something that people did. But you know what I did not do, and maybe it's worth talking about, it's outside of this topic, but why don't we talk a little bit about the creation of LBBC itself? How was it founded? Why was it founded? Who founded it?
Sure, I can do that. So Living Beyond Breast Cancer was founded in 1991 by Marisa Weiss, who was a radiation oncologist finishing her residency at the University of Pennsylvania and was inheriting a lot of patients with breast cancer from her senior doctor and realized they had a lot of questions and she didn't have a lot of time to answer them. And so she started a conference at Penn and it was a great response. And afterwards she thought, I'm going to start a nonprofit. At the time she had 3 young kids. Her husband was also a doctor, so very busy person. So she founded the organization and it really started as a conference. And it used to attract thousands of people because there was so little out there. And the conference was the first program. And then there was a quarterly educational newsletter when we used to mail newsletters because there would be information in between. And it grew from there. And Marisa left around 1998 to form breastcancer.org. And I was hired in 96. So I had a little bit of crossover with her. But we were really founded as a place to provide information, education, and support. And we've held really true to our mission. It's just the complexity has changed and the issues have changed, but really stayed true to that idea that we want to help people understand their disease so they can go back to their doctor, get the best care, find community, and bring people together. Yeah, that's how we started.
So the MBC conference was basically a follow-up to what you had already done. But I'm sure the early MBC conferences were a lot different from the early stage ones. So why don't we paint a
Well-
picture of the first couple of conferences and what was different then and from what's happening now?
We didn't distinguish between early stage and metastatic then.
True. Good point.
Metastatic patients definitely came, but we didn't have anything special. We did 2 conferences a year. There was one in the fall and one in the spring. You remember, we were really a local organization then. We didn't give travel grants. People definitely traveled to come, but most people were in the greater Philadelphia area. We kept that fall conference going. So we always had the all stages. But when we started the metastatic conference, I think we had already started with travel grants. Yeah, we did. We knew finances would be an issue, and we were national by then because we had a website and everything had changed. So that's when we started making sure we could help people offset the travel to the conference. The first conference was small. I don't know, Kathy or Elyse, you can talk about that.
The first one, we weren't sure, right? Because we were identifying stage 4 or metastatic patients who were in ongoing treatment, and some have good days and some have not so good days and some have better days, which may impact their ability to get to the conference, whether they're local to the Philadelphia area where it was held or whether they were further away. At the beginning, I remember saying, we've got to remove cost as a barrier so that if people with metastatic breast cancer want to get to this conference, that's not a factor. And so it was year 1 where we were able to identify one sponsor because nobody was doing travel grants, or few organizations were doing it. And if they were doing it, they weren't really promoting it because they didn't have a lot to allocate. We made the effort to try to identify a funder who had the ability to give some travel grants. And I remember the first year we raised $2,500 in travel grants, which meant 5 individuals got $500 to offset their hotel, airfare, and meals that weren't covered. So that was year 1. It was a smaller audience. The staff wasn't sure what to expect.
So how many
And-
people did you get around? So that will put it into perspective of how many you've got this year.
Actually, what I think we did first was a teleconference. I think we did a 2-part teleconference that first year after we did the surveys. I don't know the numbers, but I went back and saw the brochures. And I think the best number for the first conference was under 100, but I don't know.
I remember somewhere around 125. We were just breaking 100. And I also remember this was a big deal for all the staff that was going to be on site because people with metastatic breast cancer weren't seen and heard like they are today. And so the staff had some caution and concerns like, what was this going to be like on site? And what the staff came away with was how empowered these individuals were, how much hope there was, even 20 years ago at a time when there were far fewer treatment options available, no matter what your subtype was. And so people came away feeling encouraged that the goal was met, that we convened this group of people, that they benefited from the education, but they also benefited from the peer support, which was as important as it turned out to be as the educational content from the experts.
And I think, Elyse, what you have said is so important. What I've heard in 2013 through 2023, many people are still isolated in their communities and do not meet another person with metastatic breast cancer until they come to our conference and stand in a room of whatever size. Now it's 500 people, and are just overwhelmed with the sight of people sharing this disease and sharing experiences. And it is really incredible. So it's that experience that really connects people. The Hear My Voice Metastatic Advocacy Program started in 2015, and we used the educational framework of the conference to steep the advocates in what are the new treatments, what are the treatments beyond what their subtype is, to broaden their perspective of research, of treatments, of peer support. And so we first used it as an educational vehicle, and then it transitioned through the years to be a meeting place for advocates and for advocates to become mentors to those new people who were coming to the conference for the first time and a little bit timid about what to expect. Many people with metastatic disease say this is a disease no one wants, but you meet the best people. And so at the conference, I think the Hear My Voice advocates have played a great role in bridging kind of that fear to let's get comfortable, let's get you what you need here.
Yeah. I was just talking to somebody on the phone. Now, in 2026, I was talking to this woman who had been diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer a few months ago. And I was telling her about the conference that I was going, and I encouraged her to go. And she was hesitant. Even now, in 2026, she was reluctant. I can imagine how hard it must have been 20 years ago. And how did you get people to learn about the conference? It was way before social media. And what did you use? Radio ads?
We had done the survey and we did have a database, but we definitely mailed. I came across the original brochures with the old logo, but it was probably also word of mouth, maybe working through support groups and some of our hospital partners. So that's so different than the way we do it now. But I will just say, because we didn't really touch on this, when the first conference happened, there were very limited treatments for metastatic breast cancer compared to obviously where we are today. I feel like the conference grew up with some of these bigger innovations, advances in testing, biomarker testing, and more targeted precision medicine. So we were there right along with that continuum. But in the beginning, there wasn't a lot. So we didn't need as many sessions.
I was going to say, was it a 3-day conference then?
I think maybe it was like a Friday night dinner for those that were in, but the main day was Saturday. Yeah, it was one day.
And do you recall what the sessions were in the early days?
I know there were medical updates. I believe from the first conference, there was something for caregivers and about emotional support. Again, our archives are imperfect, but we're trying to resurrect all of that.
I'll just add to that. Definitely there were medical updates. We got all the key opinion leaders and medical experts at comprehensive cancer centers and other areas. And what was striking to a lot of our speakers was when we got to the question and answer session, which was always incorporated in the keynote sessions to give access to the participants to get a question answered. And oftentimes, these medical oncologists that often served as our experts would comment to the staff afterward the concerns they had based on some of the stories that the participants would share about their treatment experience, and that it wasn't the standard of care in that year or in that time. And it just showed the disparities and inequities of access to standard of care, no matter where you live in the United States.
It's interesting to note that 20 years later, we've come a long way and the treatments have improved and there's so many more options. And still, we hear the same thing.
Yeah.
This reminds me, I'm not sure when the exhibition hall started at the conference, but allies and partnerships with other nonprofits has always been a huge part of LBBC. And LBBC was part of the original, I think, Elyse, you served, then passed the baton to me in 2013 for the Metastatic Breast Cancer Alliance, where organizations were coming together and trying to figure out how to move the needle on research, on advocacy, on providing better services. And the Metastatic Breast Cancer Conference actually served as a model for other metastatic conferences across the country. Some of the Hear My Voice advocates, alumni, started them in Minneapolis and out in Seattle, Washington. We don't hold on to information, and we do share it. And we rely on our nonprofit allies for many things, including attendees.
To piggyback on what Kathy said about the Metastatic Breast Cancer Alliance and the role that alliance is playing and continues to play. And Kathy said it so well, because the Metastatic Breast Cancer Alliance was formed, was up and running and successful, when Dr. Cardoza was interested to create a similar coalition outside the US, it was the leadership at the time of the MBC Alliance that served as advisors to Dr. Cardoza and her planning committee, so that the ABC Global Alliance was then formed. And the ABC Global Alliance and the MBC Alliance in the US do collaborate and partner. So again, it shows how this connectivity and ability to share common ground, common concerns across nonprofits, industry, as you wanted to move into, and others has been happening in the metastatic community. So I just wanted to add sort of that tie to outside the US. Dr. Cardoza didn't have to start from scratch. She actually consulted Mark Hurlbert and Shirley Mertz, God bless Shirley, who were leaders of the alliance at the time, and they worked with her to say, this is what worked, this is what didn't work, this is what you might want to consider as you form a similar group outside the US.
Shirley Mertz and Mark Hurlbert were the first speakers at the 2015 Metastatic Conference that our first class of Hear My Voice advocates listened to. And they heard the research statistic that Shirley Mertz gave, that only 4 to 7% of research funding was going to metastatic disease. And the advocates that Saturday afternoon were appalled. And that night, they went in their rooms and they planned on Sunday, the next day, a die-in at the conference to illustrate how many people die from metastatic breast cancer each day. And it was a little controversial and not everyone appreciated it, but it was so illustrative of how poorly the metastatic community was being served and how this next generation of people with metastatic disease were not going to accept it anymore.
I think since two people have mentioned Mark Holber, we should just say, because not everybody knows who he was, but he was at Avon, First Aid Fund for Women. They funded a lot of breast cancer initiatives. They were travel grant sponsors for a long time. And Mark was really the driving force behind the Metastatic Breast Cancer Alliance, making sure industry and nonprofits would sit at the same table. Obviously, he went on to the Breast Cancer Research Fund. His legacy is important in all of this, just like Shirley's. And that starts the conversation of funders. We did start to get pharma support for this conference. There are a lot of conferences that get discontinued. There are many organizations that just can't secure the funding year over year. So I think it's really important that we think about the fact that Living Beyond Breast Cancer made this a commitment to fundraise really hard to make sure we could grow the conference, that we could provide travel grants. Pharma companies don't pay for travel grants, so we always had to get the travel grant money from other sources. And it's mostly been families that have been impacted by the disease, maybe lost someone, that have been extraordinarily generous. An organization called Forward for Toby, which is based out of Chicago. Before that, Komen funded them, but then Komen pulled out abruptly, and fortunately, Forward for Toby stepped in. So it's been a lot of work to keep the funding strong so that we can keep the conference going. So I just give a ton of credit to all of our funders. Pharma doesn't influence any of the content, but without them, this conference would never have sustained. Never.
But I will say, like Jean had said, Avon provided some travel grants and Komen did. And year over year, they changed their criteria for funding. There was some reason at that time with the leadership in place that Komen stopped doing travel grants, it doesn't mean they stopped giving money for other things that aligned with their mission. And they have done more focus on metastatic breast cancer. Like many organizations, they've had a number of leadership changes and things evolve.
Yeah, I think the important point for this is just that sustaining the travel grant money has taken a lot of work. We've had to create a lot of new relationships. Actually got a new funder this year who gave $100,000 for travel grants. His wife passed away from breast cancer. So there's a lot of things that happen behind the scenes because we know we can't get this money from our traditional funders. And yet we know if we don't have the travel grants, we will not have the attendance. And I was just reading the evaluations from this year, and everyone says without the grant, I wouldn't have been there.
I did not know that the biotech do not help with the travel grants. Elyse, what are the reasons, actually?
As it relates to travel grants and the importance of having them for conferences so that you remove access to the geographic location as a potential barrier when there are already a number of barriers people may face managing their disease. There's consistency across industry that pharma companies should not be giving dollars to organizations that are directly benefiting individual patients, because that could be perceived by regulatory bodies, the government, as potential inducement to get somebody to try that particular company's product. So that's one of the reasons why the industry can fund the educational sessions and other components, as Jean has mentioned, that it's been easier to fundraise. Fundraising development for physical conferences like these is a huge effort. There's a whole team of people that LBBC and other organizations hosting conferences have behind the scenes working with organizations, individual donors, and so on and so forth to cultivate the relationships that may lead to that diversified funding that is required in order to meet your goals.
Yeah, I just want to add during 2020, when the pandemic happened, we closed our office, I think March 13th, and the conference was supposed to be in April, as it traditionally is, the metastatic conference. And we needed to transfer to Zoom and different conference platforms that became hugely expensive and also a development challenge because people thought, oh, if you just put it on Zoom, that's cheap. But we were trying to recreate for people the kinds of programming that they would get in person, so to foster connection among people. So yeah, there have been a number of development challenges through the years, not least of which was the pandemic.
As Kathy said, it was March and the program was in April. So people had registered, speakers were signed up. We had a deposit at a hotel that we were bound by. We had a lot of work to do to get out of contracts, figure it out. And we were able to really recreate the conference over Zoom in June. So we didn't do it in April. It was really a big priority that we were like, we are going to find a way to serve the metastatic community. And we had really high attendance that year, I think, because people were home. For the next couple of years, we continued to do it virtually, just out of concern of safety, and particularly for those living with metastatic. So we didn't bring it back in person until 2024. And that was hard. I think we wanted to bring it back sooner, but it took a while. And we got back to our numbers pretty quickly. But I will say we did a lot of things online during those pandemic years because we realized this is working. We just have to be interviewing doctors and just doing content all the time. The staff had to pivot from being in-person conference planners to being virtual conference planners, which was a big transition. Again, all behind the scenes, but the commitment of LBBC to provide the infrastructure and the funding to say, figure it out, this is important. And that's what we did.
As a follow-up, let me ask you, once you had set up the infrastructure to do it virtually, are you continuing to offer that option to people?
Yeah, so every session is live streamed except for a couple because the caregiver workshop is more private. They're all live streamed. You can ask questions, we edit them, and they're up. So we have a virtual audience and an in-person audience. It adds a lot of expense, as you can imagine, but we know there are people that just can't make it. And I think it's important. So we'll always do that, but we believe that being in person is valuable.
Oh, no doubt about it.
Yeah.
Absolutely no doubt about it. And I have to say that a lot of us we'll call ourselves seasoned patient advocates. We actually come every year, and I haven't missed a single LBBC. I come because of the community. And meeting friends that I hadn't seen maybe a year is the key. And it's the key for a lot of us.
One of the things I wrote down, it's been mentioned, but we can dig in. The impact of social media over the 20 years of the Metastatic Breast Cancer Conference for LBBC. And as has been mentioned earlier, social media was not really utilized 20 years ago when the conference was formed. And as Jean had mentioned, awareness of the conference was through the database that LBBC had, the physicians that LBBC worked with that would distribute paper brochures when they were created, and others. But as social media started to emerge and metastatic breast cancer patients started to find one another, they had developed this deep online relationships because they hadn't met other people like themselves in their local community. And so one of the things that stands out to me as a highlight is that every year, and even though I left LBBC a number of years ago, I continued to go to that conference every year for so many reasons. But that conference serves as a reunion and a meetup place for people who may have never met each other in person, but have metastatic breast cancer, come to the conference, obviously for the educational information, but have the value of a real hug and not a virtual hug. And to see those reunions happen in front of you is quite provocative to show that the importance of being able to reach out and touch someone, because we did, going back to the pandemic, live in a Zoom world and everything was virtual. And we used to hear over and over, no matter where any of us were working, that patients wanted to continue to find each other in person. That human contact and the human touch was so vital, and that it was important.
And I'll just add that breastcancer.org has a virtual support group for metastatic. And I know this year I think like 20 people all went out to lunch together. None of them had ever met in person. So if you look at the exhibit hall at the metastatic conference, we obviously have our industry partners, but we have a lot of our peer organizations. And so it's a really incredible opportunity to bring the community together and also allow the peer organizations to connect with their constituents. We overlap in so many ways. So I think Living Beyond Breast Cancer feels really honored to be able to create a space that is not just for LBBC. We're giving a lot of connection and support. And this year and last year, we partnered really closely with Project Life, which is such an important organization, and having their input in creating some of the sessions and bringing in their authentic voices. Last year, they did the Saturday night event. And then we also have an advisory committee made up of newly trained Hear My Voice advocates, so people living with metastatic breast cancer who really plan every piece of the conference alongside the staff. So it's not like we're telling the community what they want, we're getting what the community wants, and also from all the evaluations and the years of serving. So we're really proud of that. And it's great for us. We get to see everybody, and for them, they're a little bit more relaxed than us, but it's great to see them connecting.
There are two more topics I really would like to talk about. So the first one, Hear My Voice and the change makers, and what you did this year, I thought was incredible, actually so powerful and so important when you had those faces on the screen. And so let's talk a little bit about that, and we'll finish with this year's conference. So let's talk about Hear My Voice.
Okay, let me do a little introductory, and then Jean can take over the change makers, because there's a wonderful visual on the LBBC website of both change makers, the history of treatment and how it changed, and also some other things, lots of good stuff. But Hear My Voice, when I came back to LBBC in 2013, as we noted, the internet was just forming, and these voices, there were voices of anger and fury about the lack of services to people with metastatic breast cancer, a lot of resentment against some established organizations. And people started connecting through social media, listservs and telephone conferences, as Jean mentioned.
Gosh, we date ourselves.
It was ancient times, folks,
Yeah.
but the internet really started to connect people. And as I was listening and witnessing some of these issues, I was thinking about silent voices, the research that Elyse conducted, and to these angry voices saying, hear me, this is not working, this is not good. And LBBC had already established a young women's advocacy program. And I looked at that and I said, this is what the metastatic community needs, a training program to educate, to provide some tools, and to connect. And so in 2014, we got the grant and we moved forward in 2015 with the first class. And it has been just amazing. And as Elyse said with the survey, when we first said, okay, we're opening applications, we had space for 25 people. We didn't know what to expect. We were inundated. We had over 110 applications. People were desperate for the community, for connection. We took in 31 for the first class, and so many of that class, Leslie Glenn is the founder of Project Life, but she was also a member of that first class. And so many who have gone through the Hear My Voice program have gone on to fill the gaps with organizations and other ways, whether it was a Facebook group. Sarita Joy Jordan had a Facebook group that addressed inequities in breast cancer. And there were a myriad of ways that this group of advocates has changed everything for people. So Jean, change makers.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to say about Hear My Voice, and I'll go to change makers, is that the staff works really hard to pull together not only racially and ethnically diverse group, but also by geography, by what kind of healthcare system. So we bring together a very diverse group of advocates, and we are then able to elevate them to do a lot of other projects, whether it's for industry or other peer partners, but they have this basic training. And these are people who really didn't know they even were being an advocate, but they actually were. So it's been great as we look at the cumulative impact of the years and the classes. And sadly, we've lost members. So the change makers came about in that I really wanted to find a way to highlight some of the connective tissue that we've actually been talking about for the last hour. It's not just LBBC, and it's certainly not an exhaustive list, and we could have included many more. The intention at first was to do 20 for the 20 years. I think there's ultimately 26. So the criteria was people that had been trained. So you had to either be a young advocate or a trained Hear My Voice volunteer. And for the most part, we were looking for people that were doing an impact to reach a wider audience, whether they were starting a nonprofit or a Facebook page or doing something that really stood out. Kathy worked with me on this project, which was great. And Elyse helped, and Janine too. I needed the historical memory. And then we realized we had a lot of advocates from the early years.
They had more time to be more impactful.
Yeah. So we did go back and made sure we recognized some in the more recent classes who probably will continue to do more. But it was really an honor to go through and remember these people, many of whom we're still connected with, and to show the impact. If you look at what Julia Mauis and Christine Hodgkins have done with the patient-centric dosing and GRASP, and Leslie and Abigail with Project Life and everything else Abigail does, and all these things we take for granted now. Oh, it's there, of course. But no, this all happened because advocates saw the gap, stepped in, what Stephanie Walker did. And I am a real believer of we have to remember who came before us and honor who came before us, because that's how we got where we are today. But I also knew that many people coming to that conference would be coming for the first time. and they were becoming because they really needed information and support. So we didn't want to make it a look back. We need to look forward for the community. And so that's why we did it more as something that lives on the web and a slideshow, but not like a centerpiece. And I think there's a way to add other people. I have to see if the staff added it, but we were going to add something like, who are we missing? Because again, it's not exhaustive, but I'm glad we were able to highlight.
And so am I. To me, this was probably the high point. The high point was seeing my friends, but also that wall of names and people I knew and so many I miss. And it was very powerful. But let's go around and talk about, I wanted to talk about this past conference, but I don't think we need to talk about it. I think it was a hugely successful conference. I've seen people visiting the booths of nonprofits. It was so crowded. I think you had more people this year than ever before. And so many want to come. But let's just talk about the future. What do you see in the future for this conference, for LBBC, for the future of MBC advocacy?
Jean, why don't you take it?
I was just going to say, Jean, you need to tee this one up.
Yeah, I was thinking about this. I will say that Living Beyond Breast Cancer was fully dedicated to serving the needs of the metastatic population as well as all stages. We know it's important. The conference is only one thing that we do all year long. We have a lot of other programs and services where we reach the metastatic community. I think what I heard so much this year at the conference, and I think there's been, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, like 34 new therapies over the last 20 years or something like that, or maybe it's 24. But the problem is we still haven't cured this disease, and the side effects are still really challenging. And that for some subtypes, there's not as long of a runway. And so it's very isolating. It's like, I don't have that mutation. I'm triple negative. Or even if you're hormone positive, you may run through treatments faster than you expected. So this disease is tricky. It figures out how to outsmart even new, more targeted therapies. So I think we got to find more biomarkers, the things that are actionable. We can't give up. Despite the progress of the therapies, we still have a lot of work to do. So we want to be part of that conversation in both making sure this stays top of mind. We did a needs assessment this year, and the biggest concern, and this is all stages, is the financial toxicity of cancer treatment and navigating the healthcare system, which has become so complex. So we have to really look at what is the thing that is impacting patients every single day and make sure we are building more supports around it so that they are able to afford their treatments, access their treatments, and also have some quality of life. We've made a lot of progress, but I feel like we have a lot of work to do.
It's really well said, Jean.
I was just going to add, it's related to what Jean said, but with the advent of scientific innovation and new approved treatments for people with metastatic breast cancer, 20 years ago, we referenced earlier, life expectancy after a stage 4 diagnosis wasn't that long, several years for some, depending on your subtype. But now we know many people, and Victoria, you're one of them, who've been living longer term with metastatic breast cancer. We didn't have time to talk about that today because how's that impacted the annual conference? How's that impacting people's quality of life? How does that impact people's treatment choices and decision-making as more lines of therapy may become available if someone wants to continue to try to outsmart their cancer with a new treatment? So there's a whole other world ahead to your question about the future of more people living longer with metastatic breast cancer and keeping an eye on. As Jean said, LBBC does it every single day, no matter what their program type is. What are the current needs, challenges, and preferences of people living with metastatic breast cancer? And that we need to make sure the newly diagnosed have what they need to make their early choices and get the social support they need. But we also need to be thinking about those longer term survivors whose needs continue to change and evolve with ongoing treatment.
Kathy.
And I think I'd just like to close with advocates will tell us where we need to go, whether it's for research or the psychosocial costs of this disease. I think empowering people to use their voice, to be silent no more, is a huge part of LBBC's impact and a value that the organization holds on to very dearly.
Beautifully put. Thank you.
That's great, Kathy, and that's true.
Thank you so much. We basically touched the surface here. There is still so much to talk about. So I'm hoping that we could do this more of an ongoing conversation, not just one off. So I would love to have you both, and Jean should just dropped off. I would love to have all of you come back. There is so much more to talk about. Thank you so much for being here.
You heard Jean mention Janine earlier. Janine Guglielmino spent 23 years at Living Beyond Breast Cancer, most recently as Vice President of Mission Delivery, leading its content, national programs, and patient advocacy work. And she served as Vice Chair of the Metastatic Breast Cancer Alliance. She was there when the very first conference came together in 2006. Here's my conversation with her.
Let's talk about LBBC, the conference. Tell me a little bit about how you got involved with LBBC, when, and what your role was.
I started at LBBC a couple of months after 9/11 as the first communications person. I moved from Washington, D.C. a couple of months after September 11th. I got the job because I had a friend who was diagnosed with early stage breast cancer before her 32nd birthday, I believe. So she was very young. And I went into the role thinking I knew a lot about breast cancer. And I quickly learned that I knew only about her experience with breast cancer. So when I got to LBBC, I did not know much about metastatic breast cancer. I'd never heard the term metastatic breast cancer. So it was definitely an education. And I was with LBBC for about 23 years. So by the time I left, I had done a variety of roles, but my last job title at LBBC was a Vice President of Mission Delivery. So I was there for the first conference in 2006.
I want to ask you about your impressions of the first conference and how hard was it to start a brand new conference like this?
There were definitely challenges with starting a brand new conference. And if I'm not mistaken, the first metastatic breast cancer conference was held outside of the city of Philadelphia in the suburb at a nice hotel in Conshohocken. It was relatively small compared to the way it is now. I would say there were definitely some bumps in the road for the first one. We were trying to figure out how do you design a conference in a way that accommodates the spectrum of experiences that people have with metastatic breast cancer. And it took us a little while to get that rhythm. But I do remember from that first conference, I remember this basically from every conference that we had, is that there was always someone who had never met another person with metastatic breast cancer. But at that first conference, there were a lot of people like that. And people would be emotionally overcome. They would come into the hallway and they'd be crying. And there were also people who didn't really know how to navigate a large event like that. And so we needed to help them as well. So those were some of my early memories about the Metastatic Breast Cancer Conference.
What lessons have you learned from the early days that you incorporated in your later conferences, and what do you think changed over the years? There were science updates, but there wasn't that much to update in those days, but it has evolved.
Yeah, so you point out a lot of important things, which is that the first conference in 2006, there was not a whole lot to say. So, for example, doing 3 simultaneous plenaries about the different subtypes. I believe they did that this year, but we definitely did that over the years. In that first year, I believe we said to the speaker, cover the 3 subtypes, but when she got, for example, to triple negative, there wasn't a whole lot to say. At that time, the excitement was around HER2 positive breast cancer, and 2006 was the beginning of the aromatase inhibitors. So there was some conversation about that, but it's not like it is now. You really need separate sessions to be able to talk about the different types of metastatic breast cancer, the lines of treatment. There's entire categories of treatment that didn't exist in 2006. So it's complicated. And there's also balancing how much information people are ready to take in, because you got people like you, Victoria, who know all of this science. And then you have people who are very recently diagnosed and are completely new to this world of breast cancer. I was trying to remember, but we tended to have a pretty high percentage of people at the conference who had de novo metastatic breast cancer. And so this entire world was just totally foreign. They not only had never had metastatic breast cancer, they had never had breast cancer. There was a lot to work out. And we focused a lot in the early years on the medical treatments. And there was some information about psychosocial, emotional, and practical information, but much more in later years. We were able to say a lot more in depth. We added more time for people to just let off steam and be able to enjoy Philadelphia and make connections and spend time together. So a lot of things changed over the years.
That's true. I remember a few years ago, and I don't know if they still do it. There was a tour of Philadelphia.
We did organize tours, and I didn't usually get to go on those tours, but every once in a while I would greet people and be able to get some hugs out before people went to explore the city.
But going back to what you and I were talking about before that, the challenges, it's interesting that you mentioned that because the issue still remains. Even this year, a few of us from the podcast did a little panel after we came back, and we discussed the challenges that still seem to be an issue at the conference. And one of them is, at what level do you present science? Because as you said, there are 2 distinct groups that attend the conference. And I think this year, over 50%, if not more, were first-time attendees, which is a great thing for the conference. And I'm so glad that they get so many people who are either newly diagnosed or hadn't been to any conferences before. But that presents a problem for the level of science. Did you discuss that with presenters before? And did you actually think about who would be the right person from the medical community to present?
We absolutely did. The staff of Living Beyond Breast Cancer was always looking for people who were really excellent bedside communicators. And sometimes it worked wonderfully, and sometimes it didn't. It's really difficult at any kind of large event to be able to satisfy everyone's needs. And at LBBC, we tried different things. We sometimes had sessions that were specifically for first-time attendees or specifically for people who were newly diagnosed. And the staff often would meet with speakers and explain, this is who's going to be in the room. There'll be people who are newly diagnosed, and there's going to be people who've been living with metastatic breast cancer for a long time. And we have to try and speak to all of those people. It's an ongoing challenge, and it always will be. And you also can't always prepare for what a speaker is going to say.
Yeah. You used to have a patient keynote speaker every year. And I noticed that in the last couple of years, maybe ever since LBBC came back as a live conference after COVID, it went away from that. What was the reason for having a patient keynote speaker? And why did the LBBC decide not to continue with that?
I can't say why they're not doing that anymore. I do know that we wanted to make sure that we had more of the voices of people affected. And I can't remember when Living Beyond Breast Cancer started building committees, but we started to build advisory committees that were extremely helpful, not only in selecting topics, but in having those hard conversations about how to handle topics. Like, how do you manage
How
those
do you
difficult
manage that?
conversations? And for several years, and I can't remember whether it was pre or post pandemic, men or women would come up and they would speak for 3 to 5 minutes about their experience. Then we started doing more panel conversations so that we could dig in more deeply to people's experience and we could balance, because one of the challenges of having people impacted speak is that everyone's different. It's such a diverse experience. And so it's
Exactly.
really hard also to represent the diversity of experience. And you never want someone to be at that conference that they feel that they don't see themselves in some way. So I suspect that the panels were one way of kind of digging more deeply into the diversity of experiences. And one of the things I missed the most about this conference was moderating learning from each other panel.
When in the past, when I went to the conference, I unfortunately missed most of the sessions because I was working the booth for Share. For the last 2 years, I was free to do whatever I wanted. This year was particularly good. I thought the speakers were excellent, and the breakout sessions that they did with Project Live were quite good. Can you recall maybe your most memorable moment at the conference and the most difficult one?
In terms of my most difficult memory of the conference, I would say there are several, because there are individuals that I saw at that conference who we had trained in Hear My Voice. And I was so happy to see them. But I also knew that it was probably the last time that I was going to see them. And I was both grateful that we were able to help them to contribute in ways that felt meaningful to them, and also sad that we haven't been able to do enough to save people's lives. And almost every year there was a situation like that. Gosh, in terms of memorable, I am really not even sure. I have so many wonderful memories from training the Hear My Voice cohorts, moderating the panels, being able to have casual conversations with people outside of the sessions.
Yeah.
Just love being able to see people every year, be able to put my arms around people who I'd known for a long time, like breast cancer. I talked with LBBC about one specific memory I had of Sarita Jordan, who was in our first Hear My Voice class. And Sarita is someone that I knew before she had metastatic breast cancer. She was a longtime volunteer for Living Beyond Breast Cancer when she had early stage disease. And then she was diagnosed with metastatic disease, and she was hospitalized within, 2 weeks of the conference. And she was on the Learning from Each Other panel. And what I talked with LBBC about in anticipation of this year's conference is that it was so important for her to be there that she made it happen. And it was very inspiring to see her come there and talk about specifically the financial issues that she had faced after her diagnosis of metastatic breast cancer. And I'll always remember that. It wasn't the last time that I saw her, but I will always remember that particular conversation that we were able to have, that she was able to help some people.
I think this is a good way to end.
Thank you for doing this.
Thank you for being here, and it was so good to see you. My thanks to Jean Sachs, Elyse Caplan, Catherine Ormerod, and Janine Guglielmino for sharing 20 years of memories, the surveys and silent voices that started it all, the first small gathering in the suburbs of Philadelphia, and the community of advocates it grew into. As Kathy said, this is a disease no one wants, but you meet the best people. If you or someone you love is living with metastatic breast cancer, visit lbbc.org to learn about their programs, their Hear My Voice advocacy training, and next year's conference on metastatic breast cancer. Travel grants included. If this episode meant something to you, share it with someone who needs it, and follow the show so you don't miss what's next. Thank you for listening. I'll see you at the conference.